Well, the book of Esther is by far one of the most amazing books in the entire Old Testament, indeed in the entire Bible. From a purely literary point of view, the book is so well structured, it is so well organized, so thoroughly planned that critics of the Bible have suggested that the book is nothing more than Jewish fairy tales and old religious myths. That's how well organized this book is. Okay, in fact, throughout the centuries, the canonical status has been questioned several times by both the Jews and Christians. Does this book belong in the Bible? Okay, on the surface, the book appears to be a thoroughly secular story of Jews who continue to live on in the diaspora rather than identify themselves with the restoration community in Jerusalem. That is, these are Jews who've stayed behind. They didn't come out of exile. They chose to stay in Persia. They didn't want to go back to Jerusalem. Why is their story being included in the Bible? And then the most striking feature is that God is nowhere mentioned in this book. You will search in vain looking for the word or the name God in this book. There's no mention of prayer or of worship or of any of the ceremonies that distinguish Judaism or any other thing that would identify them with their cult, basically with their worship. There was nothing there, and so the big question, in a sense, is where is God in this book? Where is God? Now, the wonderful thing about the narratives of the Bible is that stories can transcend cultures more than propositional truth can in many ways. I think that's one of the reasons why God, in a sense, in the Bible told stories, because they can appeal to different cultures in many different ways. They're very easy to transcend cultures and boundaries in that way. Now, the danger of stories, however, is that they can easily be read and interpreted to fit the subjective experiences of the reader and fail to miss the point that the author of Scripture is trying to get across. Okay? That is, we might read the wrong point out of it. We've done it before. We read David Goliath and we think, oh, that means you have to face your giants. And that's not what that means. It means Jesus faced the ultimate giant that you will actually never have to face, because he did, and because of his victory, we follow his lead. So that is one of the dangers of stories. Thus, it's easy, in a sense, for a feminist to read Esther and basically talk about how women should rise up against the oppression of men. Or it's easy for a misogynist, one of those male chauvinistic macho guys, to read Esther, and basically conclude, you see, women ruin everything. Okay, it's very easy for a man to read it that way. A moralist can read it and only want to draw moral conclusions and moral lessons on how to live. So the question that we have to ask when it comes to the story is, how can we get the story right? I think that the people through whom the book of Esther came is really the big clue in understanding Esther. Okay, they were a people who were in covenant with the creator of the universe. They were in covenant with a God who had redeemed his people out of Egypt. They were in covenant with a God who had made great promises to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. They were in covenant with a God who had promised to bless his people no matter what. They were in covenant with a God who had pledged himself to death if he didn't deliver to Abraham all the promises that he said he would fulfill to him. So the story of Esther, believe it or not, is really not a story about Esther. It's not even about Mordecai, the one who commanded Esther's every move for the most part. The book really is, in a surprising way, it is really about God. It's about God and his faithfulness to his promises to bless his people and curse those who don't. So this is taking us right back to the Abrahamic promises in Genesis 12. Hence, for the book to be understood correctly, we must not forget the entire covenantal framework or the network in which the book is included. So, as we go through Esther, we're first going to go through the story, basically just noting the basic elements of a good story. Okay, the beginning, the conflict, the resolution, and the conclusion. Okay, basically this is the narrative of the whole Bible: creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. Okay, and so that structure is part of the marvel of the book itself. Secondly, we're going to delve into the book to see why God is the point of the book, even though God is hidden. And if you notice, the title of the message is Deus Absconditus. That is Latin for the hidden God. The hidden God. Okay? And even though God is hidden, we're going to find that he really is at the very center. And finally, we'll look at the God who tells stories through his providence. So, let's get the story right. So here's my attempt at telling the story of Esther. So this is going to be Esther 1 through 10, kind of sort of in my own words somewhat. Okay. Now, the setting for the story of Esther is in the reign of the Persian king Xerxes. Okay, this is his Greek name. His name in the book of Esther is Ahasuerus. Okay. You say that 3 times and you're done for the day. Ahasuerus, okay? Xerxes, he reigned from about 486 to 465 BC. So, here's a fun fact. Does the name Xerxes sound familiar to anybody? Anybody seen a movie lately? Movie 300? Anybody? Anybody seen that movie? No? You've seen it? Yeah. Okay. The king in there, Xerxes, that is this Xerxes. Okay, if you've seen the movie, you can probably just Google image Xerxes from 300. He's a rather weird-looking guy. Okay, in the movie, he's portrayed. I don't know. He's probably like 7 or 8 feet tall, and he's just like painted in gold, and he's got earrings and chains around his face and stuff like that. Okay, he's for the most part, he's not a pretty-looking guy. He's not a very, I don't know, he's just weird. He's just an odd character in that movie. But, you know, this is that same Xerxes. Okay, this is that same historical character. Okay, in the movie 300, he's tall, powerful, he's surrounded by gold and luxuries, and Esther pretty much portrays him in that same way. He's surrounded by luxury as well as his home in Susa, the capital. Now, the story of Esther, it starts in the 3rd year of his reign. You see that in chapter 1, verses 2 through 3. Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, he's throwing a feast. Okay, he's throwing a party. Okay, now that theme of feast, okay, the party theme, okay, you're going to need to pay attention to that in the story, because a lot of the main things that happen in the story revolve around feasts. Okay, so that's something to pay attention to, the structure there. Now, the feast here is being held by the king, and the author goes into great detail to describe things like the white cotton curtain, the violet hangings with cords of fine linen and purple and silver rods, and marble pillars and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. A lot of details really put into describing the luxury that's going on in this party. Okay, now this is also a party for the men. Okay, this is a party for the men. It was the nobles and the governors, and it was given by the king. And there was drinking. There was lots and lots of drinking going on. In fact, apparently there was a stated rule, okay, that said there is no compulsion. Okay, basically there is no end. Just drink and drink and drink and have fun and have a good time. And that's what this party was about. Okay, so the men here, they're having a good old time, basically. Okay, they're having a good time. Now, the queen, okay, Queen Vashti at that time, she's also throwing her own feast for the women. Okay, you see that in 1 verse 9. Now, the story goes on. It says, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, that he commanded that Vashti be brought to the all-guy party so that basically he could show off his trophy wife. That's what he wanted to do. He just wanted to show off his wife. Okay, now back then, the queen was not for public viewing. Okay, she was not for public viewing. It was prohibited for anyone to look upon the faces of royal women. So the king is basically asking her to do something that is unbecoming of a royal woman. Okay, if you pay attention throughout the story, you're going to notice also that the king does some really, really dumb things when wine is around. Okay, he does some really dumb things whenever wine is around. Okay, now nonetheless, Vashti, she's not going to play his game. Okay, and she refuses. Okay, and Ahasuerus, he's enraged. He's mad. Okay, I mean, here he is. He's the ruler of 127 provinces. He can't rule his own wife. Uh-oh. Can't rule his own wife. So what's he going to do? He can't rule his own wife. So he's got to save some face. So he takes some advice from the wise men. I know where you're going with that. So he takes some advice, and his wise men basically tell him, look, get rid of her, can her. Show her that you're still the boss. Get rid of her, can her, and we'll replace her with somebody that's better. Okay, and so Vashti, she's demoted into the harem. Okay, now the idea of being a queen back then was rather odd. Okay, it's not because you were like from this royal line. It's just the king felt you were awesome at that time. Okay, and he had like an assortment of women, a closet of women in his harem, and he just if you pleased him at that time, hey, you're the queen. Cool. If you didn't, if you stopped, being in the good graces of the king, well, you're not the queen anymore. Anymore, go back into loneliness, go back to the harem, and that's it. You're stuck. I'll give you guys a little bit more detail later. Now, okay, so that's part of the background. Okay, now here enter our protagonists. Okay, enter Mordecai and Esther. Okay, now Mordecai and Esther, they're Jews who have remained in Persia, who did not immediately return to Jerusalem when Cyrus released the waves of Jews to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to restore their city. Okay, now Mordecai is a descendant of King Saul. It says that he is a son of Kish. Okay, that's Saul's father. And he's taken the responsibility of raising the daughter of his uncle, who was presumably killed or at least dead at that point. Okay, so he raises up Esther. He raises her up as if she was his own daughter. Now, Esther is described as having a beautiful figure, and she was lovely to look at in Esther 2:7. And when the king proclaimed that maidens were to be brought to Susa, basically to be pampered for 6 months, okay, Esther, she's taken to the king's palace, and Esther, there she quickly won the favor of the king's eunuch. Okay, the Bible says that she advanced to the best place in the harem. That's in chapter 2, verse 9. This meant that Esther, she was going to be one of the king's concubines. Okay, that needs to be clear. When she's there in the harem, that's what she's there for. She's there basically to try out for the queen, and not of her own will. It's just because she's beautiful, to look at, and somebody noticed her and said, I think the king would like her, and so she was brought to the harem. Now, listen to what scholars had to say about life in the royal harem. Life in the royal harem clearly had its advantages and disadvantages. While the women enjoyed every sort of material comfort and were indulged and pampered in many ways, they had no recourse for intimate relationship with a husband. Okay, in a sense, they were denied that aspect of being sort of married to the king. Okay, their opportunities to be intimate with the king would have been rare and would offer no companionship. It was very, very lonely in there. Undoubtedly, they found companions among other women of the harem, or even occasionally with the eunuchs entrusted with their care of the harem, but the special relationship found with the husband, raising children within a family setting, those pleasures were denied to the women of the harem. It was a lonely life. You either made friends or you just, hung around, and you were pampered. You were pampered to death, let's just put it that way. That was what the rest of your life was like. You could be completely alone. The king could have seen you one time and then just said, that's it. And then he would never see you again. And so in a sense, the relationship of marriage, the intimacy that marriage is, was denied to them. It was a rather lonely life if you didn't meet anybody in there. And in chapter 2, verse 14, we see that the women saw the king once, but never again unless they were requested by name. Never again unless you were requested by name. Now, Esther never revealed her ethnic background as per orders from Mordecai, who would come by and he would visit her to make sure that she was doing okay. In 479 BC, so this is actually after the Battle of Thermopylae, after the event from the movie 300 takes place. Okay, this is Esther's 10th month. Okay, since she was taken into the king's harem, she went to see the king, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her and made her queen instead of Vashti. That's 2:17. Her queenship is announced by another feast that is given in honor of this new Queen Esther. So again, the feast comes up. Things are happening around the eating time. Okay, now just before the end of Act 1, okay, Mordecai, he discovers a plot by two of the king's eunuchs to assassinate the king. And Mordecai, he's able to get word to Esther because now she's got the king's ear, basically. Okay, she still hasn't revealed her origins, by the way, but the king investigates this plot, and he finds out that it's true, and he has the two men hanged on the gallows. And so in a sense, there is at the end of Act 1, and it says that the act of Mordecai, it was documented in the book of the Chronicles in chapter 2, verse 23. And that's the end of Act 1 of this story. Kind of sort of a happy ending in one sense. You know, it ends on a good note, and, you know, like, in a sense, kind of like a good opera. You're on a good note, okay? Now, enter Haman. You would think that Mordecai would have been promoted or rewarded at this point, you know, because of his act of valor for discovering the plot and reporting it, but he's not. He's not. Instead, chapter 3, the beginning of Act 2, if you will, is we see Haman is promoted, and he's set above all the officials with the king. Now, Haman is an Agagite. Okay? Haman is an Agagite. This means that he is a descendant of King Agag. He is an Amalekite and an enemy of the Jews and an enemy of the house of Saul. If you remember, it was because Saul didn't execute God's justice on King Agag that got him in trouble. When Samuel came and he shows up and he's like, you know, Samuel, I did it. I did everything you asked. And Samuel says, you know, then what's this lowing of the cattle and the bleating of sheep that I hear? Oh, well, we kept the best spoil. You know, and he was, instead of killing the King Agag, he spared him. And that's part of that story. And there was continual war between the house of Agag and between the Amalekites and the Jews. Okay, so that's part of the significance of why their origins are mentioned here. Okay, now, one day, while walking past the gates, as people are bowing to pay homage to him, Mordecai doesn't bow. Mordecai doesn't bow, and Haman is furious. He is furious. He is beside himself, upset. I mean, he's livid. Okay, and Mordecai, you know, I don't know why he didn't bow, but he chose not to bow. And Mordecai, when he's asked, Haman, like, hey, how come you're not bowing to me? And Mordecai replies with the thing that he told Esther to never ever reveal. Okay, and he told him, it's because I'm a Jew. That's why I'm not bowing to you. Now, it was not considered religious homage to bow to a court official in Persia. Okay, in other cultures, yeah, bowing meant something religious. It meant an act of worship, but the Persians didn't consider that. Okay, it was just kind of normal, you know, for them. It was just cultural. That's all it was. And it's not like Mordecai hadn't done it before. It's just in this particular instance, he just chose not to bow. And his excuse was, well, I'm a Jew. I would never do that, you know. So, you know, again, we're not really sure why he didn't bow. Maybe he'd known something about Haman before. Maybe he knew he was an Agagite. The text doesn't really say, but he chose not to bow. But at this point, Haman, he begins to plot how he's going to destroy the Jewish people. I mean, that's how upset he was that Mordecai didn't bow. And Haman, he goes to the king and he says this. He says, there are certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasury. Now, talk about lobbying. Talk about lobbying to create your own laws. And again, King Xerxes, he comes off as being manipulated here. Okay, it was the wise men first telling him what to do. Now this guy's telling him what to do. Okay, and you know, and then they have some wine afterwards. So we start to see, you know, if it's not alcohol, if it's not women, it's money. Okay, Xerxes comes across as pretty weak, almost foolish in a sense here. But Haman, he uses the power of the state to start a persecution on God's people. The power of the state. And so the law is created. And the king and Haman, they sit down for some wine, and the city just goes into confusion because there's lots of Jews in there. And all of a sudden, they're being ordered to be killed. So the city's in confusion. Now, Mordecai learns about this, and he's completely distraught. He tears his clothes, he puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he's crying bitterly. That's chapter 4, verse 1. And maybe he's thinking again, what have I done? All for a little bow that didn't even have any religious significance. Look what I've done to my people. Maybe it was pride on his part that he didn't want to bow to Haman too. Nonetheless, he feels responsible. And so word gets to Queen Esther about Mordecai, and she summons him, but he won't go. So instead she sends one of the king's eunuchs that she trusts. And Mordecai, he reveals everything about Haman and how he paid to destroy the Jewish people. And he even sent a copy of the decree that went out immediately. Apparently Persians were known for their kind of postal system that they had to be able to get word out. So as soon as the king issued the decree, apparently there was like 120 or so copies that were made right away so that they could get dispersed. And so Mordecai already has one in his hand that he's delivering to Queen Esther so she can see it for herself. And Mordecai, he asks for Esther, to go to the king on behalf of the people and to beg for his favor. That's what Mordecai said. And he's like, you need to do this, or there's not going to be hope for us right now. But again, as we read, one doesn't simply walk into the presence of the Persian king. Okay? Although, even though she was the queen, she herself had limited access. She even says that it had been 30 days herself since she had seen the king. Esther 4:11. So Mordecai says to Esther, he says, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." And so from this point, Esther, she resolves to help her people. And she says, you know what? I will go to the king. And though it is against the law, I will go, and if I perish, I perish. And so Esther, she puts on her royal clothing, and she goes to the inner court where the king is, probably standing at the doorway, maybe even being denied entry at first. Probably the guards, if they have their staffs or swords or something, and they put them in the way, like, no, you can't go in here. And so, maybe that causes some sort of commotion, and the king has to look and see what's going on over there. Who's there? Who are they trying to keep out? Who's trying to rush into my presence? And so the king looks, and out of sheer grace, he extends the royal scepter toward her. And she's allowed to go in. And he says to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? Ask. Up to half my kingdom." And she responds, "I want to have a party." That's what she said. She said feast, okay? So I changed it to party for part of the story. But she said feast, okay? I want to have a party. I want to have a feast. And I want it to be just for you and for Haman. Okay. The king, he's a sucker for parties. Okay? So he agrees. He's like, look at this. My queen, she wants to throw me a party. Eso, baby. That's why I chose you. Okay? That's the Mexican Xerxes, okay? So they have the party. And you know what's at the party? Wine. Oh, yeah. Esther's smart. She's got wine at the party. Okay, and so they're drinking. And the king, he says to Esther, "Baby, whatever you want, up to half the kingdom." And you know what Esther says again? "Let me throw you another party tomorrow for you and for Haman." Yes! I love this girl! So that's his response. He's like, "Oh, you got it. You got it." And that's what she asked for. She asked for another party. And Esther, she knows what she's doing here. Esther really knows what she's doing. So Haman, he leaves that first party. Okay, he leaves and he's feeling just the way that she wants him to feel. Okay, his guard is down. Okay, he's feeling pretty puffed up, thinking that he's in the good graces of the king and the queen. Okay, he was the only one at the party. It wasn't for everybody else. It was just the king, queen, and Haman. That's it. So this guy is feeling good. He's feeling on top of the world. On the way home, even as he's walking past Mordecai, because Mordecai's still at the gate, and he sees him, and he's wrathful toward him, but he restrains himself, and he's just walking by. He's looking at Mordecai. He's like, oh, yeah, your day's coming, big guy. Your day's coming. And Haman goes home, and he tells his wife how he was honored by a feast for him, just him, the king and the queen. And you can just imagine, like, oh, baby, that's great. I'm so proud of you. But Mordecai's true passion, Haman's true passion is he wants to see Mordecai gone. He's feeling on top of the world, but he hasn't quite arrived until he feels that he's destroyed Mordecai and his kind. So his wife and his friends, they tell him, everybody's plotting here. It's like, you know what? Let gallows 50 cubits high, that's 75 feet. Let them be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. And so he had the gallows made. Got home, probably still in a drunken stupor, trying to explain everything. And first thing he tell him, make some gallows. Hey, this is your day. You're about to be exalted. You've made it, honey. Make the gallows. Surely the king will listen to you. You're the only one invited to the party now. So he has them made. But that same night, the king couldn't sleep. Now, instead of counting sheep, the king decided to have the book of memorable deeds, that is the Chronicles, brought to him. This is chapter 6, verse 1. And there he sees what Mordecai did for him, but he realizes that he had not rewarded Mordecai at all yet. And so wanting to discuss what to do for Mordecai, the king asks one of his servants. He says, hey, who's in the court right now? Haman is, sir, because Haman's building the gallows. So Haman's in the court, and so the king, bring him to me. And so Haman, he's in the court, and he's asked to come to the king. He's thinking maybe, I'll go in and I'll talk with the king. I'll throw in my little bit about Haman or Mordecai and how I want him gone. But to his surprise, the irony in the story here, the king, the first thing that he asks as soon as Haman walks in is, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Now, Haman. Haman's like, yeah, well, wow, I've never been asked to describe my own reward, and so naturally, having had a feast with the king and queen, he's thinking, he's talking about me. Surely he's referring to me. And so he proceeds to answer, and I imagine he's probably got this this nice chest out and, giving, I don't know, you can hear maybe the patriotic music in the background going on. And he says, let the royal robes be brought, and the horses be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Haman is trying to honor himself right now. Haman is trying to honor himself, and this is Haman's highest point in the story. This is his high point. He feels that the king is getting ready to exalt him even higher and higher. And then here, and this is funny, and again, this goes back to kind of literary structure, at the exact center of the book. That's where we're at. The exact center of the book. The story reveals the reversal of Haman's fortunes. And the king basically says to him, awesome, I like that idea. Go do that for Mordecai. And from this point in the story, Haman goes no place else but down. No place else but down. Haman, after basically being shamed, he's the one who has to dress Mordecai, and he walks him, he's walking the horse, and he's the one yelling, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And so he's shamed. He's torn. I have no idea what just happened. I was on top of the world one moment, and now I'm falling. And when he runs home, even his wife and his wise men, they tell him that he had already begun to fall. These were their words, and will surely fall before Mordecai. And so Haman, then he's summoned to the feast with Esther. So he's already distraught. Everybody already sees his fall. And he's summoned to the feast because remember, Esther wanted to have another party. And so while he's there, he's summoned to the feast, and the queen reveals the plot. She's like, "Oh, king, somebody wanted to destroy my people. And guess what the king's been drinking? Wine." Wine. She picks the point when to tell him. She picks the point. And so here it is. So, the king says to Esther, after he's been drinking wine, "What is your request? Tell me. What do you want? Up to half the kingdom." And here's what she says: "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." That king gets upset. This is clearly his favorite queen right now. She's in the good graces of the king. So he gets upset, and he's furious, and he's probably drunk, okay? And an angry drunk is not good to deal with. And so he gets up, and he's like, "Who is he? And where is he? Who has dared to do this thing?" And Esther, that man right there, Haman, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Oh boy. Oh boy, and the king's furious. He leaves, and Haman, he stays there. He's staying to beg for mercy. And it's funny, because as he's begging for mercy, he's probably tearing and crying. Apparently, he's trying to stumble onto his knees, okay? And the king walks in right as he's stumbling, and he looks like he's about to assault Queen Esther. And so he's like, "What?" He's like, "Oh, you look, in my own house. You're going to assault my woman in my house. And you got to insert the Denzel voice right there. I think it's Denzel. My house." Okay, or maybe I'm thinking Danny Glover, Lethal Weapon. I'm trying to place that voice. Okay, but the king's not going to have it. He's not going to have it. He's like, "Look, no, get him out." And so Haman, he's bagged and he's gagged and he's dragged out, only to be hung on the gallows that he built to hang Mordecai. Poetic justice. Poetic justice. Now, the rest of the story is the issuance of a decree that the Jews may defend themselves, because the king couldn't take back the law. Okay, so what Esther did was propose, give a decree that the Jews can at least defend themselves. And so they did. And thus the Jews, it says, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. This is chapter 8, verse 16, because of Esther, because of what she did. And many of the people even converted to become Jews for fear of the Jews. And when the king's decree went forth, those who sought to destroy the Jews, perhaps even those building the temple at this time in Jerusalem, actually it had already been built, but still reconstructing the city, okay, they saw that the reverse occurred. Okay, it's the text in chapter 9, verse 1, it says the reverse occurred, and the Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The reverse occurred. Now, there's an interesting tale at the end here also in chapter 9. Now, remember that Haman is an Agagite, okay, and that Mordecai, he's a descendant of Saul. Okay, now, again, kind of going back to the story, it was King Agag whom Saul spared and kept his spoil, and that was Saul's downfall in 1 Samuel 15. Okay? Now, moreover, the Amalekites, okay, whom King Agag was one of, they were always troublesome to Israel. They fought them in Exodus 17. So right out of Egypt, and as they're heading toward the Promised Land, the Amalekites was one of the first battles that they had. Okay, they were a problem in Numbers 14 as well. They were a problem in the period of the Judges. They were a problem for Saul, and they are a problem for the Jews under the rule of the Persians as well. In Exodus 17:16, the Lord said that there would be war with the Amalekites from generation to generation. Okay, so Saul's downfall was basically that he was not willing to be the Lord's instrument of judgment on King Agag, on the Amalekites. He spared him, and he kept the best of the spoil. Now, intentionally, okay, as a descendant of Saul, okay, in the story, he has gained victory in destroying a descendant of Agag. Okay, so there's an age-old battle that's also going on in here. And the writer of Esther, they intentionally say, and you see this in chapter 9, verse 10, 15, and 17, that they laid no hand on the plunder. It says that 3 times. Why? To emphasize that the descendants of Saul did not commit the sin that Saul did by taking the plunder of the Amalekites. Interesting. And then the final feast of the book, again, it goes back to partying, I know. But the final feast of the book, it's a celebration of the destruction of all the enemies of the Jews. This came to be called the Feast of Purim. Okay? And thus, here the story ends. This is the end of our story. Esther and Mordecai helped to save the Jewish people from utter annihilation. And thus is the story of Esther. And what a great story. There's lots of plots, there's lots of little twists, there's lots of sub-stories that are going on with it. Esther, she's a pretty smart lady. She knows what wine can do for the king and how it can help her. Very interesting story. Very interesting story. Now, okay, God is not mentioned at all in the story. God is not mentioned at all, but his fingerprints are all over the place. Okay, and I'll make the point, and I think you'll see it. God really is the main character of the book without even being named at all. God is really the main character of this book without even being named at all. Now, what do I mean? I mean that God is the one who orchestrated this whole event. God is the true storyteller of Esther. He's the one who really not only wrote it to us in a sense in Scripture, but really made it happen in time. Listen to Mark Dever. He's pastored Capitol Hill Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. He said that Esther is really one long narrative illustration of Romans 8:28. Okay, everybody here pretty much knows that passage, that we know that all things work for good according to those who love God. I was going to kind of go off memory there, but all things work for good according to those who love God and are called according to his purposes. Okay, listen to this quote again. He says that Esther is really one long narrative illustration of Romans 8:28. Think about it, okay? What if the story had been told this way? That it just so happened that Esther was Jewish. Or that it just so happened that Esther was drop-dead gorgeous. Or that it just so happens that Mordecai overheard a plot to kill the king. And that their deed just so happened to be recorded in the Chronicles, upon which the king just so happens to be restless and just so happens to read that book. I mean, when I can't sleep, I go get a cup of chocolate milk. Okay, I don't count sheep and I don't get a book. Okay, but here the king gets a book. Who gets a book when you can't sleep? Don't answer that. Okay? But Esther, and think of it, if the story had been told this way, Esther just happens to get the king's approval to approach him. And Haman just happens to get advised to build gallows 75 feet high. And the king just happens to want to honor Mordecai while Haman is exalting himself. Haman just happens to plot his own fall while plotting the rise of Mordecai. Or Esther just happens to have won the favor of getting another banquet. Or the king just happens to walk in when Haman is falling to beg for mercy, but it looks like he's assaulting the queen. Or it just so happens that the gallows that Haman had built were the instrument of his own death. I mean, think of it, if the story had been told that way. That the events of the story were just a bunch of random things that happened to work out. What if the story had been told that way? It changes the story, doesn't it? It changes the story a lot. With everything that fell into place, it's no wonders that critics of the Bible read this book as a myth of sorts. They read it and it's like, it's too perfect. Everything that happened in this story is just too perfect for it to be true. This has to be a myth. This has to be the product of some really great storyteller. But this could not have happened. It's just written too perfectly, is what the critics of the Bible say about this particular story. The book is very well structured in lots of different places. Again, the feast, the wine, okay, everything is just very well structured in this book. But as believers of the Bible, we know that this is not just a well-told story. It's also a true story. It actually happened in the way that it's described here. God was the one who decreed all that would happen before it did, and history merely unfolded the script that God had always intended. God had told this story in eternity past, and it came to pass in time. The theological word for this doctrine or this teaching is called providence. Okay, the word providence, it comes from two Latin words, pro, which means before or in front of, and the other word is videre. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, but it means to see. So literally understood, then providence means to see beforehand. Okay, this is basically slang, okay, it's theological slang for what we would call his foreknowledge. But it also includes God's provision, especially for his people. The provision of God. If you look at the word providence, his providence. Okay, his providence. It's God taking care of all things before they happen. This teaching is the basis of why Christians can say Romans 8:28 is true, that God works out all things for good for his people. Because he knows them in advance. He's decreed them in advance. It's an acknowledgement that all things, good or bad in appearance, are at all times, in all points, not just ultimately, in the guiding hands of God to direct the outcome as it pleases him. It means that we have a God who is involved in our lives. We have a God who has condescended, who has come down to really have a relationship with us. It's a God who's willing to get, in a sense, his hands dirty with us. It's not a God who just stays up there and we're down here and he just kind of looks down like from Mount Olympus and let me see what's going on down there. They got it. They can handle it. That's not the picture of God that we see. We see God who's in time with us, who's stepped down to be with us. We have a God who's involved. We have God working out in time the things that he has eternally decreed before the foundations of the world. And now in this sense, Esther is not much different from the story of Joseph in a lot of ways. You know, there are characters who in a sense they're sold out in various ways. Joseph to slavery and service, Esther as a slave to the king's harem. Both rise to prominence in their respective ways while keeping their identities hidden from certain people. Joseph from his brother until the time is right, and Esther from her king until the time is right. Both Joseph and Esther help to save their people. The only difference is that in the story of Joseph, God is explicitly mentioned. But Esther's tale doesn't mention God. Joseph explicitly tells us, he says it in Genesis 50:20, God meant all these things. Everything that happened, Joseph said, God meant this for the saving of many lives. But Esther's tale doesn't mention that at all. Why? Theologians have called this, again, the title of the sermon, Deus Absconditus, the hidden God. Or what we might also call the hidden ways of God. You see, many times in our lives, we often expect God to act through miracles. I mean, who hasn't? You know, we want God to work in such an obvious way to break through in our lives so that nobody at all can question that it was God. I don't know if this was a joke or a sermon illustration or both, but years ago I heard a pastor say this one time that there's a man. He's sitting on his roof. It's been raining. The town is flooding, and he's sitting on his roof while the waters are rising up. And they come by in a boat. You know, some of the police stories. They come by in a little boat, like, "Sir, you know, you need to come with us. You know, you need to come to safety." And the guy just looks at him and is like, "No, I'm going to wait for God to save me." You know, and okay, sir, we'll be back later. Water keeps coming up, you know, and it's up higher, and they come by again in a boat. "Sir, you really need to come with us. You know, the waters are rising. You know, you're not going to be able, to stand out here much longer. Blah blah." "Nope, I'm going to wait for God to save me." Okay. So the boat takes off, you know, and a few hours later, he has to stand up on the roof. The water's already, coming up. It's so high. Okay, a helicopter comes by. Okay, kind of like a Coast Guard helicopter, and they come by. "Sir, Last chance. You need to come with us. Gotta wait for God to save me. Okay, helicopter takes off. Well, the guy drowns. Okay, so when he gets to heaven, he's upset. He's upset, and first thing he says is, "God, I waited for you to save me, and you never showed up." And God tells him, "I sent you 2 boats, and I sent you a helicopter, and you didn't take any of them." Okay, there you go. Okay, but a lot of times we're like that too. We want God and His work to be so obvious that we won't miss it. That there's no way that we confuse it. In a sense, we want God to be so obvious that there's no risk or no faith on our part. We want God maybe to miraculously get us that job that we're never applying for. Or we want God to bring us that spouse while we stay at home and play video games all night. Or we want God to miraculously grant us spiritual growth without reading our Bibles, or without prayer, or without taking advantage of the means of grace to grow. But we see, especially through the story of Esther, that God often works in what we might call ordinary ways. Sometimes God just works in the most mundane things. Again, listen to Mark Dever. He says this. He says, "You may have missed God's dramatic role in this book because He does not act in the same spectacular fashion that He does at other points in the Old Testament, such as calling Abraham or delivering the children of Israel from Egypt. Such interventions fall under the heading of miraculous. But here, He works providentially, through the normal actions of people in the normal order of life, as He worked with Joseph and Ruth. God works sovereignly with no apparent miracles." God works sovereignly with no apparent miracles. Now, the one verse, I think, that just wants to scream, okay, Esther, this is why God made you beautiful and why God put you here right now, is Esther 4:14, where Mordecai says, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." I mean, if there would have been a place to let the audience know that God was behind everything, that would have been the place to say it in the story. But it's not there. It's not there. The author is silent. And that's interesting. And we have to ask, here, this is where I'll ask, what about your life? What are you waiting to do your work that you need to do for the kingdom? What are you waiting for? I think what God wanted us to see from this account is the risk involved in doing work for the kingdom. The risk that is involved. Esther and Mordecai, they didn't have a word from the Lord. They didn't have a prophet with them that said, "Hey, Mordecai, this is what you need to tell Esther to do." They didn't have that. They had to choose. They had to risk. Esther especially, she really had to risk. Esther had to choose to sacrifice the comforts and security of the harem for the sake of the people of God. Esther, she could have kept her identity hidden, and she could have just lived her, the rest of her life in her material comfort, and that would have been fine, but instead she risked. And she said, "If I perish, I perish," were her words. And sometimes we sit and we wait for God to be obvious to us, and I know this all too well myself, so I've preached this at myself before. I'm preaching it at you, but we don't move, we don't act, we don't risk, we don't share the gospel sometimes for risk of losing faith or losing friends. We don't stand up for Christ for fear of persecution because we're not willing to risk our lives. John Piper, in his book, Don't Waste Your Life, he has an excellent chapter on risk-taking as a Christian for the kingdom of God that I think every Christian, and especially in our country, really needs to get a hold of. In there, he defines risk as this. He says, risk is an action that exposes you to the possibility of loss or injury. Risk is possible, he goes on to say, because of ignorance, because we don't know how things will turn out with our choices and what they could trigger. Hence, risk is inevitable for us. Piper makes the point that every day is a risk. You walk out of bed, you risk. You risk twisting your ankle when you step out of bed. Okay, so whenever in a sense, what he was trying to get at is that we have a false sense of security when we say, "I'm just going to play it safe, not risk." Piper was arguing, and I think he makes a pretty good case for it. that you risk either way. You can't get around risk. Like I've heard people, in fitness, I do physical education and stuff like that, and I hear people in health and fitness, they'll say, well, I want to train my body and I want to look good, that way I can, live to be 100. And it's like, dude, you could walk down the street and get hit by a bus, and to appeal to this false, sense of security in your health, that's not the only thing that'll kill you. You risk every day. You risk with everything that you do. And so we don't know how things are going to turn out, and sometimes we think we do, and so we don't risk. Mordecai knew that when he told Esther, who knows, it was like, who knows? I mean, risk, go for it. Who knows? Take a chance. And obviously only God knows, and thus God is the one who doesn't risk. God never risks because God knows. God is not ignorant of the outcomes because he decrees them and he determines them. And again, you also think of Shadrach, think of Meshach and Abednego in the book of Daniel as well. When they were asked to bow to the statue of gold that Nebuchadnezzar had put up, a statue was like 10 feet wide and 90 feet high of pure gold. It was like, okay, when you hear the sound of the harp, the lyre, and everything else, bow to it. And they were like, no, and we will not bow. And we believe that God can save us, but even if he doesn't, we still will not bow. They risked. They didn't have a word from the Lord that said, don't bow and I'm going to get you out of the fire. They didn't know. They didn't know at all. They just risked. They had to risk. And so this story of Esther, it's about the secret workings of God. It's about his behind-the-scenes work, if you will. In fact, if movie credits were to be released for the movie about the story, it should just say producer God, director God, screenplay God, based on a true story written by God. Okay, that's what the credits should just say. We should never doubt that God is not at work for the good of his people. That's the big thing that we should add. We should never doubt that God is not at work for the good of his people, despite the circumstances. Esther and Mordecai, they had real fear when they heard the decree go out. There's real fear that the Christians are going through in other parts of the nations. There's real fear that we might even experience. I didn't read the whole article, but apparently Christian religious symbols are starting to get looked at as possibly being banned in some states right now. It's getting there in this country. It's getting there in this country where it might be scary to be a Christian, where it might be easier to just be secular, where it might be easy to be religious and not a true follower of Christ. But God is always at work for his people. He's always at work for his people, no matter what. And because of that, we can and we should risk. Indeed, there's a sense in which, again, we have to. Risk is going to be inevitable. Genesis 50:20, it's a reminder that even when God is silent, when Joseph, he cried out to his brothers, guys, why are you doing this? Don't leave me down here. Guys, why are you selling me? Even when God is silent, God meant it for good, was what Joseph came to confess in Genesis 50:20. So we never doubt that God is at work, even in the ordinary. Last point. Now, while God is arguably the main character of Esther, and what he does in and through and for his people is the main point, let's kind of take a bigger look at Esther and ask, still, what is Esther really all about? Again, some people would say, well, it's addressing anti-Semitism. We shouldn't hate the Jews. Or is it mainly about taking risk and being a risk taker for Jesus? Is it about alcohol and decision making? Is it about being courageous? Well, not at all. Again, in fact, if we read the story in parts, we might be more tempted to seek merely a moral point at the end of each chapter. So here's the point of Esther, okay? It's about God blessing those who bless his people and cursing those who don't. This is the big point of Esther. It's about God blessing his people and cursing those who don't. In a word, it is God keeping his promises to Abraham back in Genesis 12:3. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is the enduring story for the people of God. Genesis 12:3. It's proof that even in exile, even away from their home, God is still with his people. Remember, the people have just suffered a really embarrassing, shameful discipline under God's wrath. They've been exiled. They've been kicked out of the promised land. But in this story, we see God's blessings on the kingdom of Persia, even as Mordecai and Esther influenced the king for justice. And this adds to the blessings of the king of Persia, because he sided with God's people. The king's favor to Esther, though a reflection of God's grace and favor on Esther as well, served to bless him as well. And so the king's honoring of Mordecai and his continual rise only brought more blessings to the kingdom as well. And again, you think of Joseph's acceptance by Pharaoh and how his favoring of Joseph prospered his whole kingdom. Daniel's wisdom, think of that too. Daniel, in his wisdom, he served God, but where did he serve? He served in Babylon. He served Nebuchadnezzar. He served his successors. He served Darius. He served the next ruler. And their kingdoms were blessed because of their service. God blesses those who bless his people. And now the curse. The curse works itself out in the narrative through the theme of reversals. It's kind of going back to some of the literary stuff here. But what we see here is that the high are brought low, and the low are brought high. That is the reversals that happen in the story. For instance, Vashti, she's queen, but she's brought low so that Esther, who's a lowly peasant, can be brought high. And as the story progresses, we also see the rise of Haman to a prominent position next to the king. But as his hatred for Mordecai and the Jews is revealed, God curses him. And it's been noted that the reversal of Haman and Mordecai, again, that happened at the exact center of the book, when Mordecai is honored by the king, and Haman is the one who's leading Mordecai around, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." And from there, it was all downhill. All downhill. And Haman thought he would curse God's people, but instead, his plan was reversed, and Haman ended up cursing himself. And the author notes that even his own wife had said, "Surely you shall fall before him." And why? Because the God of the Jewish people himself protected his covenant people. God steps in at just the right time, and you look at this, it's through the right people, okay? The people that he has put there. Who knows if you have not been brought to the kingdom for such a time as this? There's a strong implication that God is definitely behind it all. Esther, I think in this sense, Esther cannot be understood correctly at all apart from the covenantal framework of the entire Old Testament. It makes no sense to read the book by itself apart from the covenant promises. And likewise, the climactic reversal in history makes no sense apart from the promises that God made to and for his people. And the climactic reversal in all of history is the cross of Jesus Christ. You see, God's people were sold over to sin and to Satan. It was Satan's plan to destroy the people of God. The old enmity of Genesis 3:15, Genesis 3:16, okay, that there would be enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of Satan. That comes out. In Esther, we basically see like a microcosmic view of that battle. But at the cross, we see that battle in full view. In the life of Jesus Christ, we see the highest and the most exalted person, the eternal Son of God. He was brought low, and he was plunged into the very depths of sin, and he was brought to the kingdom for such a time as this. And Jesus knew it. Jesus knew it. He knew his mission, and as a man, he plunged himself headlong into the wrath of God. And he didn't say, "If I perish, I perish." Jesus said, "When I perish." He knew he was going to die. Jesus didn't take a risk. He knew what he was walking into. He knew what faced him when he would go up on that cross. He knew he was going to take head on the wrath of God. He didn't risk. He knew. He walked right in there. Jesus Christ, he didn't risk. He gave. He knew full well what his outcome would be, even as he prayed in the garden, Father, let this cup pass from me. If it be your will, let this cup pass from me. But he faced the cross, and he faced it with resolve in our place. He faced what we fear the most, death, to give us what we risk the most for life. Isn't that why we take risks? Because it's something that we think will give us a better life? And when his enemies thought that they had won, Jesus Christ, he was raised from the dead, and he was raised all the way to the right hand of God the Father, where he waits to return in judgment to deliver the final curse upon all the enemies of God and his people. That is the ultimate story reversal in the history of God. I know it's going to be cheesy. History, his story. Okay, I know it's cheesy, but God's story. But that's really what it is. That's really what it is. That is the ultimate reversal in the story of God that he's been telling from the Bible. The resurrection, that changes everything. In the story, the rise of Mordecai changes the courage of the Jews to begin to press on in their work. Remember the temple and the city, all that was being built, and it had ceased because the Jewish people were being oppressed and they were being attacked. But now that they know what's happening, Mordecai is rising. Well, Mordecai is a Jew. That means if we find favor with the king in the capital city, we'll find favor here. Man, let's fight back, let's work. And they find courage because they found somebody who's leading them on the way. It was their reversal. And for Christians, the rise of our Lord from the grave, that changes everything. You think of the apostles. They were weak, cowardly, they were hiding, and all of a sudden Jesus is risen, he's alive, and what are they doing? Now they're risking their lives. They're ready to go to prison. They're ready to die for Jesus Christ. They're ready to undergo whatever it takes for Jesus Christ, because the resurrection changed everything. It reversed everything. If Jesus is alive, that changes the way we look at the world. And the hard ending of Esther, if you read it, the slaying of the sons of Haman and the ordered killing of 75,000 of the enemies of the Jews, it only makes sense in the light of the covenant as well. God will judge his enemies. The judgments that's delivered through Esther and Mordecai, it's just a hint of the final judgment to come. That's the end of the story that the whole Bible's been telling. You get to Revelation, that's the end of the story. That's the consummation, it's the final judgment. With the rise of Jesus to the right hand of God, he will one day return as the exalted Christ that he now is and that he reigns as, and he will judge his enemies. Esther ends with an inaugurated feast to celebrate the decimation of God's enemies, and history also will end with a feast to celebrate the judgments of God on their enemies as well. That's the marriage supper of the Lamb. Revelation 19, it reveals that feast. It's a celebration in the victory of God. The feast of the Jews, it says, that it turned them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday. Esther 10:22. The prophet Isaiah, he looked forward to a feast. He looked forward to a feast of celebration at the end of time. In Isaiah 25, verses 6 through 12, it says, "On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined, and he will swallow up on this mountain the covering, or swallow up death on this mountain, and the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away every tear from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. It will be said on that day, Behold, this is our God. We have waited for him that he might save us. This is the Lord. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation and the high fortifications he will bring down." There is one last great day of reversals that is coming. One last great day where the proud and the lofty who have exalted themselves against God and against his people will be brought low. And those who were considered to be lowly, those whom the world considered to be intolerant, to be bigoted, to be simple-minded, and to be given over to fairy tales and myths, those are the people who will be exalted to the clouds to meet the risen Jesus Christ as he descends to the earth in final judgment. God is for his people. God is for his people. The book of Esther reveals a God who, though hidden, he is active in the circumstances for his people and for the ruination of his enemies. God uses reversals, and that means that God can reverse also the direction of your life. You know, it's paradoxical, but, you can, how do I put it? You need to see that the way up is really down. If you want to be, in a sense, be viewed favorably in God's sight, you need to be humbled in your own. You cannot walk into God with pride. You cannot walk there that way. The way up is really down. If you want to save your life, you have to lose your life. Do you see the reversals? Do you see the reversals? You cannot exalt yourself. You cannot exalt your own righteousness. You cannot exalt your own agenda, as Haman did. Once Haman, when he exalted his agenda, everyone not on it was an enemy. His agenda was himself. And we have to ask, we have to check ourselves, what is our life agenda? What is your agenda? What are you living for? What are you really risking for? We need to humble ourselves. We need to see ourselves as needy and as poor in spirit. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." If we will not see ourselves as lowly, God will bring us low. So, if you're a Christian, let me encourage you to risk for the kingdom. If you're a Christian, let me encourage you to take risks for the kingdom. And why? Okay, why could Esther risk her life? Esther could only risk her life because she wasn't looking at her own life. She didn't look at her own life. She was looking at the lives of others. And so, Christian, if you're looking at your own comfort and your own life, it needs to be said, you're not looking at the cross. You're not looking at the cross if you're looking only for your own comfort and for your own security. You're not looking at the one who risked, or who more than risked, but who gave his life. And the cross tells us that we can trust our lives to God because Jesus did the same and with greater stakes, and God raised him from the dead. It is right to risk for the kingdom. It is right to risk for the kingdom. And we won't risk until we focus on Christ. That has to happen. That needs to be in place first. If we're still trying to meet our own needs for comfort and security, then we're not asking Jesus to meet those for us in the gospel. But when Jesus has our attention, when the cross is our focus, our eyes move away from us, and then we can start to risk serving the poor. We can start to risk serving the needy. We can start to risk witnessing, and we can start to risk doing so much more for the kingdom. Whatever it is that we're called to, if it's to formal ministry or to just, risk being, I heard it mentioned, risk being a better spouse, risk being a better husband, risk being a better son. We can do all those things when we look to the cross because it's not about us anymore. And we can give. We can really, really give. We can risk to speak against the morals of culture. And we don't have to be ashamed of if we lose friends or if we lose face, because we can look to the one who lost his life. That is what we need to risk, like Esther did. So if you don't walk away from this story thinking, in order to be like Esther, I just need to risk more. No, you need to look at Christ first. That's the only way you're going to risk like Esther risked, is if you look at Christ first as the one who gave. And the cross absolutely convinces us that no matter what, God is in control of the outcome. Amen.